Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to look right past that spooky, deeply ingrained myth that ancient civilizations just disappear into thin air. I mean, we've all heard the stories, right? Great empires that rose up, built monumental cities, organized thousands of people, and then, poof, they were just gone. Well, today, we're going to look closely at the evidence and uncover why that cinematic Hollywood narrative is actually completely wrong. So let's dive into this with a question. How did thriving plazas suddenly become silent ruins overgrown with plants, as if everyone literally just stepped away from dinner? One moment, priests are climbing temple stairs, and farmers are complaining about the weather. The next, the roofs are caving in. It's a mystery that has captivated us for centuries, but actually, it's built on a massive misunderstanding of how human societies actually function when they're put under intense pressure. The cinematic myth of a vanished race couldn't be further from the reality of human survival and migration. I mean, civilizations do not vanish like a magician's assistant. The archaeological reality shows us that they leave behind descendants, totally altered landscapes, borrowed words, and neighbors who remember them. The real mystery isn't where everyone went, but rather why the systems holding them together just stopped working.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that there is no giant red button marked collapse. Instead, it's a rational process where holding systems break down, forcing people to adapt. When we look at famous lost civilizations, we don't find a single apocalyptic disaster. Instead, we find droughts that weakened governments, wars that made those droughts way worse, and trade failures that basically broke everything else. When the center cannot hold, people don't just evaporate, they improvise.
Part 1. When the environment shifts, the pressure of climate on the Maya, Indus, and Ancestral Puebloans.
You know, nature is an absolute powerhouse, and how a society reacts to a changing environment tells us everything about its ultimate fate. Let's look at our first case study with the Maya in the southern lowlands. It wasn't just a drought. It was a brutal chain reaction of shrinking water, warring kings demanding resources, and failing trade networks that ultimately broke their urban system. Imagine neighboring cities having to share a shrinking water supply while their kings are busy carving monuments to explain why the king next door is illegitimate. The palace needed farmers, the farmers needed predictable water, and the rulers needed victories. You remove the water and literally every other part becomes impossible to maintain.
We constantly hear about the Maya disappearance, but this beautifully illustrates the actual truth. While a specific political system fell in the 8th and 9th centuries, millions of Maya descendants are alive today. Their languages, their traditions, their identities, they survived through later kingdoms, the Spanish conquest, and right into the modern era. The cities lost the argument for why people should stay, but the people themselves absolutely did not vanish.
Think about the Indus civilization. When they faced shifting rivers and weakening monsoons over 4,000 years ago, they didn't just sit around and wait to die in their well-plumbed brick cities like Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa. They wisely packed up their crops and moved eastward. Because we still can't read their writing, their departure feels strangely quiet to us. We have no governor's emergency plan or farmer's complaint on record. But moving away from a prestigious urban system with great plumbing but no rain, that wasn't failure. It was a highly successful survival strategy. It's a very similar story in the American Southwest. Early outsiders called the Ancestral Puebloans a vanished race, completely ignoring the living Hopi and Zuni descendants who were standing right next to the archaeological sites. They built extraordinary settlements at places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, but when a severe multi-decade drought hit in the late 13th century, coupled with rising social tension, they didn't just wander into the desert to disappear, they utilized existing kinship networks and migrated south and east to places with way better possibilities.
Because ultimately, architecture cannot make rain, it can't end conflict, and it certainly can't guarantee a harvest. The magnificent cliff dwellings weren't abandoned because builders mysteriously forgot how to build. Actually, they were abandoned because continuity sometimes requires leaving a dry home. A home isn't sacred just because you die inside it. By calling this a disappearance, we dangerously erase a very real, powerful story of indigenous survival and adaptation, and we replace it with a spooky, empty building.
Part 2. Breaking the social contract. Cahokia and the daily agreement among strangers.
Okay, let's look at another mechanism of collapse. What happens when the social contract breaks down? At its height, around the 11th century, the massive Mississippian center of Cahokia, which is near modern-day St. Louis, attracted up to 20,000 indigenous migrants. To put that into perspective, that was a massive population for the time and place. They weren't aliens or giants. They were highly motivated human beings who moved immense quantities of earth in baskets to build monumental earthworks, like the massive Monk's Mount that still completely dominates the landscape today. It was an incredibly diverse political and economic hub.
But if climate stress, flooding, or severe inequality makes the obligations of living together outweigh the benefits, the residents just dissolve that daily agreement and disperse back out into the surrounding landscape. You see, a city requires people to supply food, to follow rules, and to tolerate that neighbor who grinds maize way before sunrise. When Cahokia's political or ceremonial system stopped convincing people that the rent was worth it, the very networks that brought migrants in the first place helped them leave.
Part 3, the outside contact catastrophe, Rapa Nui and the dangerous myth of ecocide.
Now let's tackle a really famous story. Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. The old fable blames the islanders for recklessly destroying their planet to build those enormous moai statues. But the devastating reality uncovered by historical records is that their population crashed only after European contact in 1722 brought disease, and later, violent 19th century slave raids. Yes, they lost their palm forests, but the islanders actually adapted to this. They created intricate rock gardens to preserve soil moisture. So the old collapse story turned a history of externally imposed colonial violence into a tidy, convenient fable about indigenous people mismanaging their own environment.
Part 4. When Trade Networks Fail. Norse Greenland's Shifting Economy.
So what happens to an isolated society when vital global trade networks just completely evaporate? Well, cooling climates and crashing ivory markets turned a thriving colony into an isolated outpost. The Norse arrived in the 10th century, hunting walruses to export ivory to medieval Europe. But as the climate cooled into the Little Ice Age, the story didn't end with some sudden, dramatic massacre. It ended with an oddly mundane final document in 1408. It was literally just two people getting married at Halsey Church.
They didn't just stubbornly freeze at the dinner table refusing to adapt. Dietary evidence shows they actually adapted by eating way more marine food, like seals. But eventually, their economic purpose completely eroded. Elephant ivory made their walrus tusks absolutely worthless, rising sea levels flooded their farms, and the nearest supply ship just stopped coming. The remaining colonists likely just looked at the situation, packed their bags, and caught a ride back to Iceland or Europe.
Part 5, Surviving the Next Collapse. What ancient ruins actually teach us about our future.
So what does this all mean for us today as we look toward the future of our own civilization? Because as we've seen, no society is permanently immune to the shifting forces of climate, economy, and social contracts. The central takeaway of this entire explainer is that people do not simply vanish. Nature only creates the pressure, but it is our institutions and our choices that determine our survival. A drought doesn't personally overthrow a king. It just reveals whether food is stored, whether water is actually shared, and whether leaders are trusted. Collapse is just what thousands of individual decisions to leave a failing system look like from far away.
It's kind of amusing to think that one day future archaeologists might explore our flooded coastal cities and wildly misinterpret our empty office buildings as the mysterious temples of a vanished race. I mean, they might think we abandon our towers after a failed religious ritual called the Quarterly Performance Review, but we won't have been mysterious to ourselves. We will have just been ordinary people responding to rising costs, changing weather, and looking for better opportunities somewhere else. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to ponder. When our own systems inevitably change shape, and they will, where will we carry our history? Because if there's one thing we've learned from the Maya, the Indus, the Puebloans, Cahokia, Rapa Nui, and the Norse, it's that civilizations rarely disappear in one dramatic moment. First, the reasons to remain disappear, and then the people carry their history somewhere new. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it changes the way you look at the resilient, ever-adapting story of human survival.